there, this is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. I came upon Thomas Sowell's work not too long ago, actually. I found him online in YouTube videos and I started watching him. And I noticed something that was really interesting with Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is a Black man who was born and raised he was in New York City at one point in his life, living in Harlem. And so, oops, I've just got a background here. It's very strange. Let me get this off. Okay, so I'm sorry, I had this thing going on. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about discrimination and disparities, and I'm doing that because I read this book. I've marked all kinds of pages that I want to go over today, but one of the things that I think is really important to you is to look at someone like Thomas Sowell. He was born, I think, around 1930. He's still alive today, and he is a well-known intellectual who was educated at places such as Harvard and the University of Chicago. And he came out of Harvard as a Marxist and went into a very conservative University of Chicago and met Milton Friedman, who greatly influenced him. And so he's now Dr. Thomas Sowell. He is an economist, and he has a lot of very good opinions. And one of the things that he said that I agree with is that we are supposed to back our opinions empirically. So you shouldn't just go out there and make assertions based on no empirical backing. And the only way to get published traditionally has been to back assertions with facts, with statistics, with a lot of information. Some of the fallacies that we've encountered today that are out there in society have been perpetuated, according to Thomas Sowell, by people who are maybe Harvard intellectuals, who sometimes make assertions, but they don't back them with factual data. For example, the gender pay gap, the racial pay gap, the idea that there's systemic racism. A lot of these assertions haven't been backed empirically. And so one of the things that Thomas Sowell does in his book is he goes through a lot of these fallacious things that are perpetuated in society. And so I'm going to go ahead and highlight some of the points that I found intriguing in this book. And I would highly, again, recommend it. It's called Discrimination and Disparities, because I think what we need to do is we need to get to the bottom line. What is the truth? We're all seeking the truth. Before I get into this, I want to make a quick mention. So I listened to our sermon, a Pastor Jim, today at my church. And one of the things that he said was he was talking about Jesus and how people were constantly trying to trick Jesus. The Pharisees and the Sadducees in particular wanted to trick Jesus. And so they decided they were going to try to trick him by asking him, and this is in the Pharisees' case, they were going to ask him about whether or not Jesus and others should pay taxes to Caesar. And so Jesus thought to himself, now, why are they asking that? Because Caesar had justified paying taxes to Caesar based on the fact that he said he was divine. Okay, Caesar believed he was divine, he was divinely ordained, and he himself was a god. And so he used that to justify paying taxes. But he also took that money, of course, to build the infrastructure of Rome and the Roman roads and all of those things that had really been moving people from one place to another quite nicely during Jesus's time. That was all in place. And that was one of the reasons why the apostles were able to spread their word. But they came to him and they said, should we pay taxes? And Jesus said, well, show me a denarii. And that's the coin where people would pay taxes. And so the Pharisees presented Jesus with a denarii. And Jesus said, whose image is on the denarii? And they said, well, that's the image of Caesar. And he said, okay, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. That was a very clever answer because it was telling them that Caesar had issued the denarii. And Caesar, therefore, was entitled to the denarii, the payment of the denarii. So it was actually quite interesting. So I just wanted to mention that really quickly. So the first thing that I'm going to mention that I actually didn't know about, and as a firstborn child, I find this really fascinating. Although I can say in my particular case, I have two siblings who are making much more money than I am making because one went in and formed his own business that's doing quite well. And the other one is very high up in a very big corporation in a vice president's position. So those two are doing better financially. So some of this doesn't apply in my particular case. However, education-wise, I have a PhD and they don't. And so I guess in that way, this birth order idea is really interesting. So this is super interesting. A study of national merit scholarship finalists, for example, found that among finalists from 5-child families, firstborn was the finalist more often than the other 4 siblings combined. Firstborns were also a majority of finalists in 2-child, 3-child, and 4-child families. So here's what's interesting. IQ data from Britain, Germany, and the United States showed that the average IQ of firstborn children was higher than the average IQ of their later-born siblings. Moreover, the average IQ of second-born children as a group was higher than the average IQ of third-born children. Who knew? A similar pattern was found among young men given mental tests for military service in the Netherlands. The firstborn averaged higher mental test scores than their siblings, and the other siblings likewise averaged higher scores than those born after them. Similar results were found in mental test results for Norwegians. And he, of course, has cited all of this with the backings in the studies. The sample sizes in these studies ranged into the hundreds of thousands. These advantages of the firstborn seem to carry over into later life in many fields. Data on male medical students at the University of Michigan, class of 1968, showed that the proportion of firstborn men in that class was more than double the proportion of later-born men as a group, and more than 10 times the proportion among men who were born fourth-born or later. A 1978 study of applicants to a medical school in New Jersey showed the firstborn overrepresented among the applicants, and still more so among the successful applicants. Most other countries do not have as high a proportion of their young people go on to college or university education as in the United States. But whatever the proportion in a given country, the firstborn tend to go on to higher education more often than do later siblings. And so this completely applies in my family, which I find as far as the education. So my sister has an MBA and she has a CPA, and my two brothers have bachelor's degrees, and she's the secondborn and the two brothers are the third and fourthborn. So I just find this fascinating that studies have shown that this is not unusual. And so I just wanted to say that. So now we're going to talk a little bit about China. So I'm moving pages into his book, and I'm just going to cover some of these different topics that I just found super fascinating. China was for centuries the most technologically advanced nation in the world, especially during what were called the Middle Ages in Europe. The Chinese had cast iron 1,000 years before the Europeans. A Chinese admiral led a voyage of discovery that was longer than Columbus's voyage, generations before Columbus's voyage, and in the ships far larger and technologically more advanced than Columbus's ships. One crucial decision happened, however. In the 15th century, China, however, set in motion a radical change in the relative positions of the Chinese and Europeans. Like other nations demonstrably more advanced than others, the Chinese regarded those others as innately inferior, as barbarians, just as the Romans likewise regarded peoples beyond the domain of the Roman Empire. So I'm reading this directly from Thomas Sowell's book. Convinced by the exploratory voyages of its ships that there was nothing to be learned from the other peoples and other places, the government of China decided in 1433 to not only discontinue such voyages, but to forbid such voyages, or the building of ships capable of making such voyages, and to greatly reduce the influence of the outside world on Chinese society. And so this happened, and plausible as this decision might have seemed at the time, it came as Europe was emerging from its dark ages of retrogression in the wake of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and was now experiencing a renaissance of progress in many places, in many ways, including progress based on developing things that had originated in China, such as printing and gunpowder. Columbus's ships, though, not up to standards of those once made in China, were sufficient to cross the Atlantic Ocean in search of a route to India and to inadvertently make the world-changing discovery of a whole atmosphere. In short, Europe had expanding opportunities for progress, both within itself and in the larger world opened up to it by its expansion into the other half of the planet at a time when China's rulers had chosen the path of isolation. Not total, but substantial isolation. The straitjacket of isolation inflicted on many parts of the world by geographic barriers that left whole peoples and nations both poor and backward. So that decision in 1433 ended up influencing China in a negative way for centuries to come. By self-isolating, they actually cut off production. And China turned around. If you guys don't know this, around 1949, Mao Zedong came into China. He was a horrific dictator, communist, authoritarian. He took all the land. What's what communists do? They take away the property rights of people in China. And so he took away people's property rights and he forced people to work on these farms. And it was very agricultural based. And so people would work in these farms. They would all be given a plot. Like say you'd have 100 people be given this gigantic plot of land, and they each had to produce on the land. And the Chinese said, well, if you pay us as if we're, if you pretend to pay us, we'll pretend to work. And of course, they didn't feel motivated because their any of the production that they did was part of a collective. In other words, working hard did not pay off because everybody would share the outcomes equally. Okay, so it was equality of outcomes, which is always problematic. So what happened on these farms is, again, production lagged, as happens in all these communist societies. They're always a disaster. That's one of the things when you take away the human's motivation to work hard because you're paying everybody equally, equal outcomes, people are going to contribute equally at a very low rate. So China was doing terribly. Then what happened is, in a particular place in China, some people got together and they said, listen, let's go ahead and plot off certain portions of land for each of us, and we'll each be responsible for these portions of land. And if we do well in our little portion, then we're going to be paid better than if we don't. And the Chinese government, this leaked out and got to the Chinese government, and they realized, wait a second, we can't ignore this. When people have individual accountability towards certain plots of land, the production goes way up. And so the Chinese started opening their gates. And around 1978, they opened the gates of to the gates of the world and decided to start being partially capitalistic. And capitalism has helped them thrive into today. Now, China's GDP per capita is still really low. It's about $10,000 per person. However, Chinese has thrived quite a bit. Unfortunately, with the recent government in China, Xi Jinping, we've got more authoritarianism than we've had in a long time. And people are increasingly being discriminated against. It's really terrible what they're doing with the ethnic Uyghurs, who are ethnic Muslims in China. They've taken 1.8 million of them and they've thrown them in concentration camps. And what they're doing in those places, according to a lot of different groups, NGO, non-governmental organizations, what they're doing, unfortunately, is they're torturing these people. They're in some cases sterilizing them. They're not allowing the women to give birth and have pregnancies. They're forcibly aborting some babies, and they're also killing some of them. And this is in the name of re-educating them. They don't like the idea that there are Muslims because they're an atheistic government. Okay, so another thing that's really interesting that Thomas Sowell talked about is the fact that humans are, even though we say all men are created equal here in our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, everything's founded on individual rights, and individuals will be punished equally for equal acts. Like, for example, if somebody commits murder, they're supposed to get a certain sentence. Okay, it's illegal to commit murder. It doesn't matter if you're a king or you're the CEO of a major organization or you're just a pauper on the street. You're supposed to get equal treatment in the eyes of the law. Okay, so that's the idea that all people are given equal rights, equal individual rights. And that's really actually quite revolutionary with the US system that's been duplicated in many parts of the world. But one of the things that Thomas Sowell pointed out that is pretty important is that we just have a lot of inequalities in general around the world. I feel like I was won the lotto in life by being born in the United States. How different it is to be born in the United States relative to being born in some other places that are totally impoverished. So I won that. And he points out the differences also in geography and the differences also just in our own human characteristics. So, for example, I was born with a certain propensity of intelligence, a certain level of intelligence. A lot of that's heritable from my family. And not everybody's born equally intelligent. Okay, you have different levels, and a lot of it, again, is heritable. They've shown that in studies like the one from Elise in 2006 in the Journal of Organizational Behavior. But if you want to talk about other differences that people are given, there were differences in height, differences in muscular content, differences in athletic ability. Certainly we can say that Michael Jordan and Tiger Woods are far better in their fields than many other players against which they compete. So we have differences in all of these kind of things. We also have differences in what we put in. Okay, some people are motivated to work harder. Some just do work harder. I've always been motivated to work as hard as I possibly could because in my family, laziness is sort of considered a mortal sin. But one of the things that Thomas Sowell has emphasized in this book is these inequalities, in effect, can really influence your life. He says geography, well, actually, here's what he says. He's talking about the differences in countries. Some countries have more resources, and he talks about the really big importance of being on the coast. And so he says, geography is an intractable obstacle to the equal or random outcomes implicitly assumed to be the norm in the absence of discrimination or genetic differences. The huge cost difference between water transportation and land transportation is just one aspect of geography that creates skewed distributions of outcomes. Back in the days of the Roman Empire, the cost of shipping a cargo across the length of the Mediterranean Sea, more than 2,000 miles, was less than the cost of carting the same cargo 75 miles inland. You hear that? So it's just much less expensive to travel by ship back then. This meant that people living on the coast had vastly larger universe of economic and cultural interactions with other people available to them. A geographic treatise pointed out that in ancient times, the European hinterland was lingering in a backward civilization as compared with the Mediterranean coastland. So it was a great advantage to be on the coast. And we still see that today. Countries that are not landlocked have more advantages than those that are landlocked. He also points out coastal peoples around the world have long tended to be more prosperous and more advanced than people in the same race living farther inland, while people living in river valleys have likewise tended to be more prosperous and more advanced than people living up in the isolated hills and mountains around the world. He also says climate and soil are likewise geographic obstacles to equal prospects or equal outcomes. Most of the fertile land in the world is in the temperate zones and little or none in the tropics. This affects not only agriculture, but also the timing and pace of urbanization based on the productivity of food required to feed concentrated urban populations. And so that is just a really interesting perspective as far as geography. He also says mountain people within Italy have produced no such landmark achievements as those in the rest of the country's population. He points out the disadvantage of being in the mountains, and we can see that here in the United States in the Appalachia. So I want to also say hi as I'm looking into the chat. I see David's and thank you, Jesus. And so David says there are no leaders or authorities not put there by God and to obey them. And so we are supposed to obey our leaders. That's true. God does not want to inspire us to go and wage war on our leaders or to be marching in these ridiculous marches and protests that end up in riots. I'm not saying the traditional peaceful protests, those can be good. We need to protest sometimes if something's going wrong, as we saw last summer. Some of the things that were going on last summer, obviously George Floyd was a terrible thing. However, that said, we also need to make sure we're not waging wars or rioting or looting or doing all those kind of things. That is not something that God would want us to do. Another thing that is interesting and what has been a hot debate in the United States is this idea of raising the minimum wage. So our federal minimum wage right now is very low, relatively speaking. It's at $7.25. And the state minimum wage, if you have a higher state minimum wage, then the state, if you live in that state, that's the one that the employers are supposed to pay. So in Florida, we just passed legislation that we're going to be raising the minimum wage here in Florida to $15. And so some people would say, well, what is that? How is that a good deal to raise the minimum wage? In many Nordic countries, they don't have a minimum wage. I have to say that with the caveat that they do have very strong unionization, and the unions sometimes set the wages pretty high. But we also see that there just isn't a federal minimum wage or state minimum wages there. So one of the things that we just want to point out is what he's looking at. Now, Thomas Sowell, the interesting thing about him is he takes a perspective where he goes back into history and he digs up exactly what happened. When did the minimum wage come about? Well, that came about by the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Franklin Delano Roosevelt set the minimum wage. And he has something really interesting as far as how the minimum wage law has impacted us. Now, my kids are 15 and 16, and I've been encouraging my oldest to work this summer. And I'm talking to him about that. But maybe people say, well, why should I pay this kid who's never had a job, a real formal job anywhere else? Why should I pay him a high minimum wage? Why should we pay him $15? It's going to be hard in a couple of years. It's going to, when this actually rolls out, it's rolled out over a couple of time periods, but it's going to be hard to get these teens employed when they have no skills and they need to get those skills. And so that's going to be one of the tricky things. Now, here's what Thomas Sowell has said about this. As well, empirical evidence is consistent with this hypothesis. So here's the hypothesis. Where supply and demand leave no chronic surplus or chronic shortage of labor, qualified Black job applicants turned away have to be replaced by attracting additional other qualified job applicants from other groups by offering higher pay than what pay would be supply and demand in a freely competitive and non-discriminatory labor market. Okay, so he says empirical evidence is consistent with this. The prevailing national minimum wage law in the United States is the Fair Labor Standards Act, as I mentioned before. However, high rates of inflation that began in the 1940s put virtually all money wages above the level specified in that act. As a practical matter, there was no minimum wage in effect a decade after the law was passed. As economist George Stigler pointed out in 1946, the minimum wage provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act have been repealed by inflation. He says, what is particularly striking is that there was no significant difference between the unemployment rates of Black and white teenagers in 1948. The unemployment rate for Black 16-year-old and 17-year-old males was 9.4%. For their white counterparts, the unemployment rate was 10.2%. For the 18-year-old males and 19-year-old males, the unemployment rate was 9.4% for whites and 10.5% for Blacks. In short, there was no significant racial differences in unemployment rates for teenage males in 1948. And then he says, and that's when there was no effective minimum wage. Then he says, after the effectiveness of minimum wage law was restored by recurring minimum wage increases in later years, not only did teenager unemployment rates as a whole rise to multiples of what they had been in 1948, Black teenage unemployment rates have become much higher than the unemployment rates for white teenage males, usually at least twice as high for most years from 1967 and into the 21st century. And so he's just pointing out one of the drawbacks of having these really high minimum wages is not only the fact that 89% of US companies happen to be less than 20 employees and very resource constrained, but also because, and he didn't point that out, I'm just pointing that out. And also it's because the teenage employment is going to be down. Okay. So that's something that's usually an issue. So yeah. Hi, Oliver Catwell, welcome here. And David says, why not 100? If you guys, one of the things I think that should be involved in government is people who've actually owned and operated a business. So you can see the logic. Why not 100? Well, you have to earn 100 and you have to be market valued at 100. Look at some of these principles. Why is a salesperson paid a certain amount of money? Well, it's because he or she sold products, and maybe they're getting paid a commission based on how much they sold. Your levels of productivity directly reflect in what the market is willing to pay you for whatever type of kind of work you're doing. Someone says, I'm a business professor. Why is a business professor paid a lot more than a history professor or an art history professor or anyone in the arts or even in a lot of the sciences? Why are business professors paid more on levels like engineering professors? And why are medical professors paid so much? They're paid a lot more. Law professors. Why is that? Well, it's the market. Okay, the market, supply and demand. We have a lot of students going into the business majors, and so we need a lot of professors. And the market demands in other schools have kept the pay pretty high, almost twice as much, in many cases actually well over twice as much than that of, say, psychology professors or sociology professors. It's just a lot higher. And so as a person who's choosing a field, choosing a major, I love psychology. I would have taken psychology, but I realized the pay was about twice as much if I went into management, business management. So I did. I went into management. Made a lot more sense. So I just encourage people, when you're looking at in majors or in types of jobs that you choose, be sure to choose ones that are going to be financially lucrative for you. And so you'll be able to pay your bills and pay off your student debts if you have student debts. Here's another interesting thing. So we're going to look at sorting people in housing. So this is something that we've got a lot of people out there who are saying, well, there's still discrimination. Somebody just sent me a couple of studies that I need to go through that are saying that we have systemic racism and we have problems and that and this and that. One of the things that Thomas Sowell points out in this book is the drawbacks of a lot of the government programs and welfare programs that we put out. And the drawbacks, because they might demotivate people from getting married. We see 70% right now of children born into to Black mothers, 70% are born in unwed families. The mothers are not married. And so that tends to end up sometimes in poverty, unfortunately. It's very unfortunate. And so one of the things that he said is some of the welfare programs that we have actually encourage people not to work because it's more beneficial to them financially just to stay home, maybe live in government housing and to not have a job. And it's financially incentivized to have more children in these kind of environments as well. And so unfortunately, it ends up being a vicious cycle where you're encouraged not to go to work and pick up those jobs and get the skills, and you're encouraged to stay home. And so that has not been good on people. And Thomas Sowell makes a very big deal of this. He says, yet another study of the Moving to Opportunity program published in the economic journal Econometrica likewise concluded, we found no significant evidence of treatment effects on earnings, welfare participation, or amount of government assistance after an average of 5 years since random assignment. The American Economic Review, the official journal of the American Economic Association, reached similar Conclusions: no consistent detectable impacts on adult economic self-sufficiency or children's educational attainment outcomes from the movement of thousands of people into higher income neighborhoods than the ones they came from. Okay, so what he's saying here, he says, we did not find evidence of improvement in reading scores, math scores, behavior, or social problems, or school engagement overall for any age group. So he's saying the advocates of unsorting neighborhoods, whether by race or by class, argue that living in a better neighborhood will produce benefits for both adults and children who are moved in, and benefits of diversity for society at large. But these expected benefits to the newcomers from housing projects and high crime neighborhoods have repeatedly failed to show up in extensive empirical studies by a wide variety of researchers on the federal government's Moving to Opportunity program. Okay, so we just don't want to see that. He says, in addition to these scholarly journals, a study published by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development was based on research that on the same program, which followed more than 4,600 very low-income families in 5 U.S. cities over a 10 to 15-year period to examine the short-term and long-term effects of moving to low-poverty neighborhoods. Its conclusion was no discernible benefit to economic self-sufficiency, employment outcomes, and risky and criminal behavior for adults was observed as a result of moving. Similarly, moving had few positive effects on educational achievement for youth. One of the things that Thomas Sowell really encourages is to take a look at charter schools. He actually wrote a book on the benefits of charter schools and how a lot of people who are in the Black and Hispanic population completely thrive in these charter school environments. And so he says that that's something that people might want to think about in these other locations. And so another issue is this idea of adverse impact. And so I want to go 1964, Title VII. One of the things that is kind of a general theme in this book is that Thomas Sowell, we acknowledge that there was horrific treatment of Black people in our history. Okay, slavery was an egregious thing. Unfortunately, slavery had been going on in all parts of the world at one time or another in ancient history. People just enslaved other people, and in our country, we enslaved people by race largely. And so people were mistreated. And so thankfully, that Republican, Abraham Lincoln, and other Republican people were very much against slavery. So we fortunately were able to get rid of slavery. However, following our discontinuation of slavery for the next 100 years, it wasn't until 1964 when we finally had Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Prior to that, we had redlining in neighborhoods where people were purposely not giving loans out to people who were ethnic minorities. We also had the problem of the Jim Crow laws, which were segregating people and discriminating and justifying racism. So we had a pretty terrible history. If you went back to 1950, an employer could easily go up to somebody and say, I'm not going to promote you because you're a woman, or you're in this minority, or you're this and that, you're Asian, you're Black, you're white, you're Latino, whatever it is. They could do that in the 1950s completely legally. So we have that in our history, which is really awful. But fortunately, in the 1960s and 70s, a series of laws were passed that got rid of some of this. You're not allowed now to discriminate based on a person's race, religion, color, national origin, or sex. And then just recently, last summer, it was also passed that you're also not allowed to discriminate against people based on their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And so this discrimination has been wiped out, meaning that you're not supposed to do it. So if you do it, if you have practices in your organization that have what they call disparate treatment on employees, meaning you've purposely created some sort of restriction or some sort of a qualification that somebody has because you want to discriminate against people, or you have adverse impact in your organization, disparate treatment versus impact. Impact is the idea that you've got a program in place that is adversely impacting particular groups. Like, for example, and you have to say, is this a bona fide occupational qualification? So, for example, if you're working at Federal Express and you're a driver, you need to be able to lift heavy boxes. Now, is this going to adversely impact little old ladies or people who are have certain disabilities? And of course, they're protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act, or older people protected by the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. Well, sure. It is, but it's a bona fide occupational qualification because it's part of the essential functions of that job. So you need to be able to lift the heavy boxes if you're a driver shipping all these packages, working for FedEx. Same thing with in Dallas, they require that firefighters can scale a 6-foot fence. Now, is that going to adversely impact women and people who have certain disabilities, old people, all that kind of stuff? Sure. But they found that there's enough 6-foot fences, and part of the job for a firefighter is to get past that it's okay. It's legally okay to have that particular requirement. Now, another thing is they require pilots in these commercial airlines to have a 4-year degree. Somebody sued and said, wait a second, that's adversely impacting my population because my particular minority group is less likely to have a 4-year degree than other minority groups. And so they had to look at that and they said, well, can you show that someone who can perform better with that degree than someone who can't? And they found that as a pilot, actually, it's a legitimate bona fide occupational qualification. The opposite's true when a particular case called Griggs versus Duke Power came about in the 1960s and 70s. We had people who had different educational opportunities. And Griggs was an African-American who had applied for a janitor position at Duke Power. And they said, sorry, you have to have a 4-year high school degree or we're not going to let you be a janitor. So that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they used what they call job relatedness. And they said that you need to show that a janitor who has that degree can perform better than one who doesn't, or else you can't have that requirement if it adversely impacts protected groups. Well, turns out that you don't need a 4-year high school degree to be a janitor. There's no difference in performance. And so they had to throw away that requirement. So adverse impact is something that is out there that the courts are looking at. There's tons of cases out there that people are claiming that their group is being harmed by qualifications that are enacted or rules or different things like that. And so I want to say what it says. And this is something that I hadn't really thought about that I'm bringing up because here's the deal. So you want to look at what companies have to do is you have to look in your organization also to look at if you have what they call a manifest imbalance. So you go around your organization, say I'm looking at Walmart, and I say, what are the levels of minorities who are working at Walmart? How many minorities, how many Hispanics, how many blacks, how many whites? You look at all of the different groups. You look at the age groups, you look at males versus females, but you don't take Walmart as a whole. You go by department. Okay, I'm going to look at all the cashiers. I'm going to look at all the store managers. I'm going to look at all of the people in the top management team. So I'm going to different departments and I'm looking at, is there a manifest imbalance? And what does that mean? That means it's lopsided in some way. Like, for example, say if you found that 90% of all of the store managers happen to be white males, okay, that looks like something is imbalanced there if you've got 90%. So then your next question is, okay, are they getting the applications from people of other populations for those positions? Or is this just something that just happens to be? Like, for example, truck drivers tend to be male. Few females apply for a job as a truck driver. Carpenters tend to be male. And that's because you really just don't see as many females trying to get those jobs. But one of the things that we have, so you look at different departments, you look at different positions. When I was working as associate dean at my university, I looked at the different departments. I looked at economics, finance, and I just looked at the composition of the faculty in those departments. And I realized that in our economics department at the time, we had 0 females. 0. So I contacted the department chair and he said, we just really haven't had as many applicants from female economists, but we'll take note of that. And so today we actually have a few female economists, which I'm pretty happy to report happen to be rock stars in that department. Really, really great females who had gone into economics. But in certain fields, you just don't see maybe as many women. It's more likely that women will not choose the STEM fields, for example, and they choose jobs that tend to be more nurturing, like K through 12 teachers. K through 12 teachers are lopsided to women. Okay, but so we're just getting back to my point. So you have to look at, do I have manifest imbalance? If I do, should I be actively targeting underrepresented groups? And that's typically what you want to do. Now, here's the interesting little wrinkle that I had never thought of in all these years of teaching this stuff. It's what Thomas Sowell found. He looked at companies choosing things. Like, for example, when you're figuring out if you have a manifest imbalance, if I'm in Miami, I realize that a lot of my workforce probably should be Hispanic because Miami is very much Hispanic. It's a big Hispanic population. So I would guess that my workforce is going to be having a very large component of Hispanics. However, if I'm in Iowa, I'm probably not going to have quite as many Hispanics or quite as many people who are Black because Iowa tends to be lopsided in the other direction. And so you look at that and you look at where organizations are locating. So I know if I'm figuring out where to set up my organization, I'm going to be drawing from that local population to populate my employment ranks. And so here's something that I had never thought of. Employers have incentives to locate their businesses away from concentrations of minority populations so that they will not be as legally vulnerable to costly charges of discrimination if their workforce does not end up with the same demographic makeup as that of the surrounding population. Who thought of that? Who thought of that? And so I would have never really thought of that. He says some Japanese firms seeking to find locations for their first businesses in the United States have specified that they do not want to locate near concentrations of Blacks in the local population. This is something I just honestly had never really thought about, and it's something that is not good. So American firms that do the same thing, being more familiar with both the legal and the social atmosphere in the United States, may be less likely to leave a paper trail. Nevertheless, this raises the question whether anti-discrimination laws, as applied in the courts, provide incentives to discriminate against racial minorities, as well as incentives not to discriminate, with their net effect being uncertain. So this is just something that you guys might want to think about. It's something that I had not thought about. Now, Thomas Sowell then gets into this thing called, he gets into what he calls errors of omission. David has got some really interesting opinions. It's getting racist and sexist. I'm giving you the facts, David. If you can go into the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or you can go into pay scale, you can go into places like that, you're going to see what's going on as far as people choosing different groups and choosing different types of jobs. You just have more males. You're going to find right in there in the STEM fields, that's science, technology, engineering, and math, than you do have females. It's just a simple fact. Males choose those fields more often than not, and females tend to choose K through 12. Pay scale lists all this out, so I'm not making this up. They've got the data that show that, and so do other sources. Here's what we have. One of the things he calls errors of omission. And so a lot of times people will make an assertion. They're going to say, hey, how come not as many people who are in certain minorities aren't getting loans? But they exclude this information about where the credit score is evenly applied. So for example, if they want you to have a 700 credit score and you don't have a 700 credit score, and you're not going to get the loan. Okay. So he says in the year 2000, for example, data from the US Commission on Civil Rights show that 44.6% of Black applicants were turned down for those mortgages, while only 22.3% of white applicants were turned down. These and similar statistics from other sources set off widespread denunciation of mortgage lenders and demands that the government do something to stop rampant racial discrimination in mortgage lending institutions. The very same report by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which showed that Blacks were turned down for conventional mortgages as twice the rate for whites, contained other statistics showing that whites were turned down for those same mortgages in a rate nearly twice that for Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians. Okay, I just found in pay scale, when they took out and they looked at racial disparities, and they looked at the pay gap, okay, the racial pay gap, look in the gender pay gap and the racial pay gap. If you go to the OECD, you're going to see that there's constantly this reports that on average, women get paid 80 cents on the dollar. Now, the OECD is so interesting. It takes all of the data and doesn't control for a single thing. So it includes all the women and averages them out, and all the men in whatever job they're in. And so if you have more men who happen to be in the STEM fields, for example, versus the K through 12s, it's just going to show there's a difference. Pay scale realized, well, wait a second, let's take a look. And this is the same thing with racial disparities and claims of racial discrimination. So you go back and you take a look at, okay, we need to look at control factors. We have to control for a person's level on the job, their years of experience, their location, the type of job that they're in. And then you have to compare apples to apples. And so pay scale did that. And once those factors were controlled, the differences diminished quite a bit. And so, for example, you'll see that the variation between racial groups is between 97 cents on the dollar and $1.03 to white men. So if white men are held at $1, if you're an Asian male or a female, you're averaging more around $1.03. $1.03 versus if you're in an ethnic minority, you're more around 97, 98, or 99 cents, depending on which group and if it's male or female. So the difference, the pay gap, is much more narrow. Now we have to also apply why. Well, numerous studies from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and others have shown that women tend to work fewer hours on average. Numerous studies have shown that. And so that's just one reason. So you could also say if a male and a female both go for a promotion and both are rejected, the female is statistically less significantly likely to try again. Okay, so that's just something that's out there. So those are just things to note. Now, who's paid the most? Pacific Islanders males are also paid more than white males on average. So while the rejection rate for white applicants was 22.3%, the rejection rate for Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians was 12.4%. But such data seldom, if ever, saw the light of day in most newspapers or on most television news programs, for which the black-white difference was enough to convince journalists that racial bias was the reason. So here's what it says. One of the few media outlets to even consider alternative explanations for these differences was the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which showed that 52% of blacks had credit scores so low that they would qualify only for less desirable subprime mortgages, as did 16% of whites. Accordingly, 49% of blacks in the data cited by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution ended up with subprime mortgages, as did 13% of whites and 10% of Asians. So you can see there are variations between racial groups. And so you have to take other factors into account when you're looking at this sort of thing. He said, this is kind of an interesting thing, also referencing the poor. He said, among the other factors often omitted or distorted in discussions of income disparities is the time dimension. People in the bottom 20% are often spoken of as the poor, and in the income in that quintile has not changed much over the span of years, and it may be said that the income of the poor has stagnated. But the great majority of people initially in the bottom quintile do not stay there. Okay, there is nothing mysterious about the fact that most people tend to begin their working years in a lower occupation with lower incomes than they will have in later years, after they have acquired more experience, skills, and maturity, as well as a longer track record by which they can be judged. So he's saying it's not stagnant. The middle, when you first start in the workforce, when you're, say, 16 or 17, you're making very low pay, relatively speaking, you don't have very many skills. And then through the years, by the time you're about 40, you're doing much better financially. That tends to be the way it goes for most people. You usually move up the income scale to where the time you're 50 or 60, you've accumulated pretty good money. Okay, so that tends to be what happens. And so that's just something he points out that I think is interesting. He says the amount of labor demanded can be measured either by the number of workers employed or by the number of hours that they work, or both. A study published by the National Bureau of Economic Research measured employment by hours of work, as well as the number of workers employed, and concluded that the minimum wage ordinance lowered low-wage employees' earnings by an average of $125 per month in 2016. So that is to say, this minimum wage could hurt people. Okay, it lowered it because they were working fewer hours. Employers might not hire as many people if they have this higher minimum wage. We're going to watch what the effects are in Florida with the minimum wage. There's another issue with automation. So if you raise the minimum wage to $15 and people were paid maybe $7 or $8 before that, $7.25 or more, you raise it to $15 and some of those positions are going to go away, especially the cashier positions that tend to be held by these less skilled workers. So they just replace them with machines. You can see that right now at Walgreens. You can see it at Home Depot. A lot of these machines. Walmart's got that too. Another factor that Thomas Sowell got into, and this is again, if you guys are just coming in here, is Discrimination and Disparities by Thomas Sowell, who's a very knowledgeable Black man who lived in Harvard for a long time and worked his way up the economic ladder to greatness. He's 90 years old and he's still out there putting out books. I noticed his track record of putting out books is incredible. He's released tons and tons of books. Very factual stuff too, which is what I like about it. You guys remember the Roaring 20s? And so we go back to the 1920s, and then we had, of course, the Great Depression that hit in the 1930s. One of the fallacies that comes from those times is that FDR helped get us out of the Great Depression with his wonderful acts. Everybody says that. But actually, some of the acts of him and his predecessor turned to our disadvantage. For example, after the stock market crash of 1929, unemployment went down. At first it went up, and then it went down to about 6%. Then what happened is there was the passage of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, where they put tariffs on about 900 products or imports coming into the United States. That had a detrimental impact on tons of people who were employed, and unemployment rates rose to 20 and 25% of the population, and those just stayed stagnant for a long time. And so then FDR decided to enact a bunch of laws to try to get people to work. And of course, there was the war and there was all this kind of stuff. And people feel that they've sort of rewritten history. But a lot of those acts that he's enacted, those welfare programs and things like that, in the long run have been detrimental on the population. But one of the things that some people have tried to craft is try to say that the 1920s were a terrible time and that it was awful back then. But here's what he says. He says the 1920 census was the first census to show Americans living in urban rather than rural communities. While the urban majority of the population was just over 51% at the beginning of the 1920s decade, the rate of increase of the urban population was more than 8 times the rate of increase of the rural population. The 1920s marked a historic transition to a very different kind of society. At the beginning of the 1920s, just 35% of American homes had electric lights, the same proportion that had gas light, while another 27% of those homes were lit by lamps using either kerosene or coal oil. But after that decade ended, 68% of the homes in America were lit by electricity in 1930. Home radios were virtually non-existent at the beginning of 1920. The first commercial radio station began broadcasting to the general public that autumn. Subsequently, 24% of American homes had radios by 1925 and 40% by 1930. Most American families also had an automobile for the first time during that decade. As of 1920, 26% of American families had an automobile. But so many more families were able to buy cars during the 1920s. When that decade was over, 60% of American families had an automobile in 1930. Here's another little fact. The number of Americans attending colleges and universities doubled between 1920 and 1930. The 20s were also the first decade of regularly scheduled airline passenger service, which had fewer than 6,000 passengers in 1926, but more than 170,000 in 1929. So just Thomas Sowell just gets into some super fascinating stuff. He said, talking again about the Great Depression, he said, an economic study of the Great Depression in a leading scholarly journal in 2004 concluded that the effects of government policies had prolonged the Great Depression by several years. But the contrary view has largely prevailed by sheer repetition and by its consonance with the prevailing social vision. So people are crafting a narrative around the Great Depression that is largely not true. One of the things he talked about was this Secretary Mellon. And he said there's a quote that has been attributed to him, but it's a complete falsity. It's not based on what he actually said. And so here's what it says. A widely used history textbook, co-authored by a number of well-known historians, 2 of whom won Pulitzer Prizes, said of Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, quote, it was better, he argued, to place the burden of taxes on lower income groups and that a share of the tax-free profits of the rich, Mellon assured the country, would ultimately trickle down to the middle and lower income groups in the form of salaries and wages. This is this fallacy of the trickle-down effect, claiming that anyone even justified or said that we should have a trickle-down effect. The funny thing is nobody actually said that with statistics. Nobody said this. Even Andrew Mellon did not say this. It says Mellon's own book, Taxation, the People's Business, in fact, argued just the opposite, that higher income people should pay more tax revenue to the government rather than having high tax rates on paper that were merely a gesture of taxing the rich while allowing them to escape actually paying those high taxes by investing in tax-exempt securities. You guys should know this. The top 25% of income earners in the United States pay 86% of the taxes. Okay, so the top 25%. The top 1% pay about 25% of the taxes into the government. And if you're in the very lower quintile, you're getting some money back for the most part. And so through different programs like earned income and that. And so you want to look at that kind of stuff because it's pretty important when you're making these justifications. One of the things that was found was when you reduce taxes on the rich, like for example, in the 20s, the taxes at one point in the early 20s went up to 73% on the rich. The rich simply found other places to invest their money that were tax-free so they could avoid paying taxes. They would invest in things like municipal bonds. So they put their money in that and they didn't have to pay the taxes. But when they reduced the taxes to the rich to about 25%, right now we're at about 37%, and that's probably going to be raised to 39%. But when you reduce the taxes to the rich, it has the effect that the rich actually get out of the bonds and they start paying their fair share of taxes. And so that's just kind of an interesting thing that Thomas Sowell also got my attention to. And so here's this study. He's actually got the numbers here. So it says It could be a valuable project for a student to go to a library or to the internet and check what Andrew Mellon actually said in his little book Taxation, after which a check of internal service data would enable the student to find out how much tax revenue was collected from people in different income taxes before and after the highest tax rate was reduced from 73 to 24%. Okay, so he's just talking about that. So wanted to point that out. Let's see what else we want to talk about. Oh, this idea of Marxism is also something. Now, it was really interesting because Thomas Sowell said that he was a Marxist when he came out of Harvard, and he went to the University of Chicago, which was very conservative. And now he's conservative, and he's been conservative for years. And he's been on shows with William F. Buckley and a lot of other very famous people. I saw him just recently there's some videos made with him and Jordan Peterson. I don't know if he's met Jordan Peterson from the videos I saw, but there's people like that he tends to align with. Some of his ideas also align with people who are conservatives like Ben Shapiro. And so, okay, so he says one of the things that people like to talk a lot about is distribution of income. And the Marxist idea is that people are oppressed, and we have this oppressor class. So there's oppressors and the oppressed, and money's distributed. But people forget this idea of money is not really distributed. Money is earned and you work for it. And this idea of the dirty capitalist is something that just isn't good to have, because capitalism has largely benefited the United States. We don't have another socioeconomic kind of system that benefits in quite the way that capitalism does. And so that's just something that I just wanted to point out. Oh, here's something that's also very interesting with respect to welfare programs. He says, in Britain and the United States, the prevailing social vision, endlessly repeated and reinforced in the schools, the media, and intellectual circles, depicted social pathology as caused by poverty and oppression. Yet in both countries and others, after the welfare state produced higher living standards for low-income people, the social degeneracy that is supposed to reduce rose instead to far higher levels. Okay, so that's just something that's not good. Among the areas in which social degradation spread especially far were public housing projects, public being one of many euphemisms for government. These projects have now so long been cesspools of physical wreckage, social pathology, crime, and violence, not only in the United States, but in Britain, France, and elsewhere, that many people today might be surprised to learn that it was not always like that. What is not surprising is that the big turnaround in public housing projects in the United States began in the 1960s. A 2009 retrospective article in the New York Times described the earlier years of public housing. Now here's what he says, quote, "These were not the projects of idle, stinky elevators, of gang-controlled stairwells where drug deals go down. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, when most of the city's public housing was built, a sense of pride and community permeated well-kept corridors, apartments, and grounds. In the earlier decades, when not everyone could afford to buy a television set, some housing project families who had television sets would leave their apartment doors unlocked on Saturday mornings so that their children's friends could readily come in and watch the children's programs on television that were broadcast then." He also says people were willing to sleep on the stairwells. They were willing to sleep, outside if they needed to in those stairwells, because it wasn't crime-ridden at all as it is today. So yeah, Nathaniel Robinson is asking a pretty good question here. Let me come back to that. It's S.J. Thomason. If not, then maybe the sources of the U.S. doesn't mean capitalism and the undisputed best economy. Well, a few things to note about China. Number one, people are being oppressed there pretty radically right now. We see that with the Uyghurs. We also see China right now really putting its muscles onto Hong Kong. Doesn't like the idea that the Hong Kong people have been doing so well financially because of their free markets. We see right now that we look at the United States and you look at our gross domestic product per person, it's more like around $60,000. It does vary a little bit year after year, but it's always around high 50s or $60,000. The gross domestic product per person in China is around $10,000. So no, they might take over because of their sheer size. We only have 331 million people and they have 1.4 billion people. So their sheer size is going to make them a big economic power. And we have to watch out for that. And we also have to watch out for China encroaching on other countries around it, as we're seeing now with Hong Kong. The Chinese people are very good people, though. It might have a bad government, but the Chinese people tend to be very hardworking. No matter where they go in the world, and Thomas Sowell's pointed this out in the book, no matter where they go, whether it be Singapore or they go to Australia or they come here to the United States, they tend to do very well in productivity. They tend to thrive. And a lot of that's based on the fact that they're hardworking people who value education. And they really encourage their kids to do their homework and go to school and to work very hard. And it pays off. You can see, like I mentioned before, Asian men and women make on average more money than white males here in the United States. And so that's just something you're going to see right there. So we have, they're also disproportionately represented in our universities. So there are very hardworking people who've unfortunately been suppressed by their own government in China. You don't have the individual rights in China that they have here in the United States. You don't have the kind of property rights that we have here. You don't have a rule of law. I would read Francis Fukuyama's book, Identity, to get a real grasp on what I mean by that. Francis Fukuyama is another excellent author. He's more left-leaning than obviously this author, Thomas Sowell. I think it's valuable to read both and just to get a good picture on what's happening. So he says, in many less developed countries in the 20th century, whether the Europe, Asia, or Africa, where higher education was a new experience for many, those students whose cultural backgrounds provided no intellectual experience, traditions, or norms as guidance tended to be softer, more superficially attractive subjects in the social sciences or humanities rather than the hard sciences, engineering, medicine, or other challenging subjects with major practical implications. And so he's talking about people like, here's an example. He's just saying, like, for example, the Chinese might be more likely to go into the STEM fields versus maybe people in other ethnicities might choose softer fields. And so he puts examples. He says, when Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir bin Mohamad complained that Malay students admitted preferentially to the universities, neglected their academic studies, and were drawn towards politics, he was in effect echoing what had been said of Romanian universities between the two world wars, that they were numerically swollen, academically rather lax, and politically overheated. Most Romanians were illiterate at the beginning of the 20th century. When there was a great expansion of the younger generation into higher education, Romanian students tended to choose the softer subjects to study, with only 1% studying medicine, for example. There were similar patterns in third world nations that gained their independence in the Second World War, such as Sri Lanka and the African nations of Nigeria and Senegal. So he's just pointing out the benefits of choosing more mathematically oriented subjects, and more statistically oriented subjects can pay off a little bit down the road. He also talks about Jewish people. And really one thing I really did not know about, that when I studied from him and also from others, is the patterns of discrimination against Jewish people historically. I knew that they'd been discriminated against. I was very well aware of the Spanish Inquisition and those kind of things. But I didn't know that they were forced to live in particular neighborhoods that were pretty awful, impoverished neighborhoods in places like the Roman Empire. I didn't realize how they were treated through the centuries, pretty, systemic discrimination. Yet despite that, despite being completely oppressed through the centuries, Jewish people have tended to thrive in education. Right now in the United States, Jewish people in many cases are at the top of their game. Many awards are collected by Jewish people. They're all throughout Hollywood. They're all throughout politics. They're all throughout medicine. They're in the legal services. They're all throughout the country in very high level positions. And people like Ben Shapiro, he says, historically, my group has certainly been oppressed and certainly been put down and definitely been discriminated against. And we don't even need to get into World War II to know about that. But their group has also really worked hard. And so I look at my Jewish friend. She's so interesting. She's got two sons like I have. And she says she's not going to let them get into sports because she feels that's a waste of their time. They need to get into academics. And her sons read a lot of books and do a lot of things that my kids aren't as inclined to do. It's really hard for me to get my kids to read. And so that's pretty unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. And so that's just something that we see. He says, nor are a number of other groups who have played similar economic roles in countries around the world and face similar hostilities. And so he says, for example, they say the Chinese and the Jewish people tend to be among those groups that have been discriminated against over time. So seeing what else I have. I've got one last thing from him talking about refugees. So he says the last thing that he's going to say here is just talking about refugees. And and how a lot of times when refugees end up being expelled from one country, they go into other countries and they perform very well economically. And so he's got examples of like the Cubans who fled Cuba, who have been thriving here in the United States as great capitalist players down in the Miami area, especially. I'm very familiar with a lot of Cubans down there. And also people who fled places such as who fled other parts of the world. A lot of times they tend to thrive very well once they get into other places. And so, yeah, I want to say hi to Hate, Love, Nothing, and hi to all of you who are in here. I hope you enjoyed this. I went over a lot of passages here from Discrimination and Disparities. The great thing about this book is Thomas Sowell has gone to great lengths to back his assertions up with data. And I think that's very important. We have a lot of people who are peddling nonsense today, who are claiming claims without having them backed with academic statistics or any empirical studies. And so you want to go back and you want to look very critically. Thomas Sowell has made me think better. I think he makes anyone think better when you read his stuff. And so I highly recommend picking up one of his books or listening to his YouTube videos at the very least. So thank you so much, everybody. Please like and subscribe and do come again. And remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Thank you. And I'll see you later.